Okay, I am doing a summary or a reading review of something that I've read. I haven't done one of these for a little while, since I reviewed or summarized my notes on some academic papers. This time, I believe it's still a paper, or part paper, part report, part suggested methodology, as far as I can understand. But I'd like to try and summarize what I noted and what I learned from this this text. I've got the digital version up on the screen, but I haven't done notes digitally this time. I've done notes in a paper copy, which I will be going through. So apologies if there's page turning paper noises as I sort of go through my notes. And I'm going to be looking sort of down here to review some of the notes that I've made. But this is going to be relatively quick because I didn't actually make a huge amount of notes on this piece of work, but I think that some of the notes that I made are really interesting and important. So essentially, this is a multiple page paper. Let's see how many pages we're at. We are at around, I think, 69 actually. It's 69 pages. Some of that obviously is cover and contents and things like that, and introductions, which kind of bring up the page count. Really, the sections that I found the most useful, I actually really struggled with the first section. It's very much the theory and introduction, which is kind of to be expected in something like this, but it was the hardest going part of the paper or text for me. The thing that I found easiest was the various case studies and use cases, and I'll get to that when I get to the section about why I think that not only was it the most accessible part of the text generally, well, for me specifically, but possibly generally for other people, but also why maybe it's one of the most important parts of the paper for the intended audience. And I think something to note is that the author, or one of the primary authors, notes a few times that they are not a designer and aren't within the sort of technology and design field. They are within the human rights field. You can get some more details from the introduction of the author about like what their specific kind of part is, but they make it very, very clear that they are coming from a perspective which is not entrenched in design history or technology history, that is more from the human rights angle, which is good. It's a good thing to bring folks into different industries that have different perspectives that aren't entrenched in are quite, well, not quite, our colonial ways of doing a profession or doing design specifically. So the first section that I've got some notes on, or at least some underlines on, are on page 6. If we go past the contents, but the general structure is sort of theoretical introduction. There's a center section. There's sort of like an explanation of what the framework is kind of trying to describe, in that there are central expected cases that technology and design designs for. There are marginalized cases, which are reasonably well known now, that we try to include after the main case, the marginalized cases, which is this paper is largely arguing that that is the wrong way to do things, essentially, is and is kind of widely accepted now, that if you build for the most accessed, like in terms of have minimal marginalization, identity kind of needs or accessibility needs. Basically, if you're, if you design for the quote unquote easiest use case first, and then kind of expand your whatever you're making out to the marginalized cases, that you're not designing effectively in the sense that it becomes very add-on, and actually doesn't necessarily work particularly well for either case, which is kind of widely talked about outside of this text as well, but broadly covered in this text. And then there's a bit about security and privacy and details. There's a bit about the different kinds of things that make up a decentered user, or decentered or margins user. And I think they do use the word user quite a lot as far as, or humans, you could people you could describe as, and that the decentered folks are actually on the outside of marginalized. So if marginalized describes those that have more needs that are unique than the most easily accessed of users, that the decentered cases are the users that are criminalized, or the users that are outside of like legal frameworks, that are undocumented, are the most, like the highest risk in terms of safety concerns or human rights concerns. So I think that this got a little bit confusing for me, because I often describe marginalized cases for things to include those cases. So my idea of marginalized or high-risk users are inclusive of, or has been historically inclusive of, people that are at the highest risk of safety concerns, or other kinds of decenteredness. But having a way to define that independent of, I guess, marginalizations isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's an interesting thing. But yeah, I do wonder, still after reading this and looking at the framework, what specific benefit there is to, and this language doesn't feel quite right to use, but like singling out the decentered cases. I think that my understanding is that because the decentered cases are on the furthest fringes of the most accessed use case, that if you design for them, that you cover marginalized cases, and then also the, you know, typical use cases, so that you're further going out to design for the most difficult, quote unquote, difficult cases, that then encapsulates all the rest. Anyway, there's a bit about corporate responsibility. I think that this is again, language, this doesn't feel quite right the way to say it, but it feels somewhat inadequate as a section. I think a lot of the questions that I had in this section were around that connected to a lot of the examples, actually, about the not only corporate responsibility, but like personal responsibility on how this actually gets done. And I think often when I read a methodology, or I read a paper that proposes a way of doing better in what we do in designing technology, I often find it as empowering as disempowering when I then come to think about the practical implications of actually doing this or funding this, if I can be so bold as to say that really the things that came up in my mind were about funding, as well as like the explicit and implicit ways that doing this kind of work is discouraged within certain spaces, organizations, and just not even certain organizations, but within the like ecosystem of work, quote unquote, work. Anyway, they then go into some other use cases, actually, that I was really happily surprised about, that were not big kind of high profile sounding things with like memorable names like Meta, Facebook, Airbnb, all those kinds of things in the other case studies. There was some detail about smaller organization efforts for different tools and apps and things that have come out of some of the decentered communities that they describe, or some of the needs from the decentered communities that they describe in terms of like, this is what this should do, or this is what a feature should include, as opposed to this tool exists. And I think that's partly probably to protect the name of the tool, or the tool generally, and therefore the people that use the tool, but also possibly because it maybe doesn't exist yet, or exists in multiple places potentially. There's then talk about like how designing for the margins is done in other industries, which is so completely true, like that there are like many other industries which are would not exist or operate if they weren't making sure that people were not going to be harmed. Like the most vulnerable people were not going to be harmed, right? That you can kind of really like pick into some of the highly regulated, I guess, in industries. Maybe that isn't really what is described here, but that I kind of think of them as like the regulated industries, in that if you build a building that does not in some way meet the needs for a livable state, then, you know, it's in some circumstances, not in all circumstances, it's not going to pass codes or things like that, or depending on the social, the city and the social sort of environment, that it's not going to pass certain regulatory things. Not that always actually, that example even really holds up particularly well, since there's lots of places that build structures that have no, you know, or have otherwise unknown to me ways of assessing safety, or even that there are people living in unsafe buildings or no buildings at all. So, you know, sometimes I think that this is a good section to have, just to kind of better understand that design and technology can be regulated in that way. And I use the word regulation, it doesn't feel quite right, but anyway, but it's got good examples of how other industries do it. And then there's a bit of like diagramming for how to actually try and use the process, the methodology, with the identifying decentered cases. And I feel like I found a gap here. I don't know whether it is, but I'd like to talk more about what I didn't find. I also still am struggling to clearly see how this is done in like a practical sense. Some of it was almost too familiar to me in sort of like, not to be presumptuous, but like, oh, I've done that before, I've done that in projects before, have I been doing this kind of process just anyway? And now that there's somebody that's kind of formalized it and put a label to it. Anyway, so let's go to page 6, which is where so I'm going to skip over the sections that I don't note, and I'm going to go to the sections that I've noted on my paper copy, essentially. So the first section that I've noted is page 6, which is here. So we've got concepts and definition of design for margins. DFM is how they abbreviate design for the margins, or design from margins, sorry. And I think that this is generally a good statement to embody within the industry. I don't think that it's unknown to a lot of people, or a way of describing this, but it's this sentence here, which is, this is grounded in the knowledge that when those most marginalized are designed for, we are all designed for, which, you know, can't argue with. If you design for marginalized cases, then the theory is that you will design for the cases that are not marginalized, but then you've still designed for the marginalized cases. I've put a note at the bottom of this page. It's a question, essentially. So these two sections go on to like talk about centering those most harmed by privacy and security issues specifically here, but then it kind of broadly talks about human rights legal, and it breaks things down actually a little bit later on. And then the last one there is not separate from the broader historical context, but it's this section, I think, that is without an understanding of broader impacts and harms in technologies. Oh no, wait, sorry, I didn't scroll enough. It's this section which is the through understanding and establishing who is most impacted by social, political, and legal frameworks, we can understand. And my question was like, where do designers see gaps? And I think that my question might also be a how do designers see gaps, and do designers see gaps when they're designing? And I think that big question that sort of came from me reading this was, you know, it's great that there's writing about this, but how do broadly the design space take on this this knowledge, this understanding of how to pay attention to those gaps, and do they see those gaps? I think that that feels like a piece of research that's not yet done with designers. It's like, where do you see, or what people, I don't know what the research question really would be, but what in your experience has not been designed for, or who, or what groups? I really liked this section here on the next page, which is when we are extremely abstract in general, the dominant group's vision gets implemented, which is great, you know, in the sense that it's from Timnit Gebru, who I believe was part of Google at one point, and in their facial recognition AI department, although that could be incorrect. But anyway, I think that this is just another great sentence to embody, although I do feel like later on in this paper, there is a lot of specificity about particular groups of people, and also mentions of intersectionality or intersecting kind of decentered criteria / characteristics. But I think that one of the things that I was thinking of when I underlined this, and later on as I finished the reading, was how do we get more specific and less abstract about groups? You know, the suggestions from the paper are largely like collaboration with people that are within those communities, or with the context. But I think that there's a step before that where we are going to struggle to not be abstract until we have more clear knowledge of like how to identify decentered, and that they do go into that, but I'm not quite sure about how to, you know, recognize a decentered group for whatever you're doing. Because I'm working on or trying to understand decolonial design practices, I've tried to see where I've kind of noticed things that are mentioning a decolonial approach. We've got a section here which is to move away from the extractive race and gendered power imbalances and extractive models that are often employed in many co-design and participatory design processes, which is very true, and I very agree with it, very extractive. And I kind of somewhat expected the design from the margins, decentered approach to suggest alternatives to those processes through the suggestion of collaboration and things like that. But I feel like, unless I missed something that was quite small, it feels like that is still not there's not a suggestion for how to solve that, and to not be like extractive. Maybe that's the personal work that the people engaging with the methodology or process need to actually do, and that's something separate. But also it kind of felt like something that was missing to some extent, or something additional work that needs to do. Not that, you know, you can't cover all bases with one paper, right? there's a lot of talk about like the move fast break things again, and we can't afford to break our communities, which is, you know, very familiar and very important, and bears repeating, to be honest. It can be repeated as often as it needs to be, until like companies, organizations, individuals, and those like responsible understand that the breaking of communities and individuals through moving fast and breaking things, or not considering the decentered or marginalized cases, means, you know, break is an abstracted term for like kill. Essentially, you kill people within communities by not having this done. You know, it could be several steps removed, but still it happens. So page 13 has a really interesting diagram that I found really fun to look at, and also to add something into, which was the development and design iceberg, which kind of makes me laugh because memes. But anyway, we're talking, they talk about the different things to consider. I think, you know, these underneath the sea level of this iceberg are all the things that are less considered within a design topic, or the issues, mainstream design issues. So we can sort of see accessibility as sort of slightly above sea level, because it is being considered more. Mainstream design issues are probably, you know, the kind of things that we would that are reasonably well socialized within the design space. Then underneath we have like the deeper effects of accessibility, or the deeper needs of accessibility, social, political, and legal. The thing that I added in to this diagram, which I'm going to be using in a workshop, is again, because I'm thinking about colonial ways of doing design, I sort of added in the water, or described what the water is around the iceberg as like colonial history. Because I found it interesting to think of these topics, social, political, legal, accessibility, within the context of that iceberg exists within a sea of historical colonialism, and the iceberg isn't necessarily going to be outside of the sea at any kind of point. Not that the metaphor is perfect, but it's sort of like the it's the thing that kind of all of this is submerged in. And I think that when I talk about colonial history, you know, we can talk about like things like, you know, probably to some extent like different isms, like capitalism, socialism, and all that kind of all those kind of ideological side of things, and the effect that those have, even though like they can be encompassed in social and political. But there is like, I feel like there is a benefit to however people want to describe the water that this iceberg exists in. I found it useful to write colonial history as the water. It kind of helped me better think about those terms. I think there's then these descriptions about the different issues, except for I don't believe that they have actually done accessibility or explained accessibility, probably for reasons that they are slightly more well known or well discussed. But I found this section within the legal part interesting. So DFM requires knowledge about legal structures that most impact the target or untargeted users of the technology, or I'm assuming untargeted is like, no, the targeted, it would be the decentered cases. Users of the technology, for example, are there documented discriminatory laws or policies or that impact the daily lives and existence of these groups, such as penal laws that criminalize sexuality, ethnicity, race. And it goes on to describe those things, but this is something that I've been interested in for a while around like to what extent design as a practice, as a role, as something that you do, needs to be more knowledgeable on like personal and institutional educational levels about the legal implications of different things. And this, again, it's not a new concept. There's lots of talk about like how design, when it's not considering, when designers haven't been necessarily educated or understanding of legal implications, that they've designed something that then, you know, is illegal in some way, and they've been prosecuted. I think the most famous one is the car case. I can't quite remember the car manufacturer, but anyway, I found the next section of social. I underlined the conditions of society, of the society. And my note next to conditions of the society is that, so they describe social issues as conditions of the society, and they're different for different places, which makes sense, right? But I had a question largely around how designing globally within social issues that are different globally, question mark, essentially, like designing globally within social lines could be like a, and should it be a ever expanding process? And again, it kind of brings me to that question of how do you find the decentered groups for what you're doing specifically? And it comes back to that again, that comment about abstraction not being, you know, being the thing that to try and move away from, to be more specific. But yeah, it really it feels like it all comes down to trying to identify who is the decentered case. I mean, there's another thing that I noted on just page 16, just a nice quote, which or just a nice line, which is consultations are conducted after a feature tool or product is already ideated or created, when it is too late to create something meaningful for this group. Hard agree, but also there is like a prevailing probably needs to be changed notion about like, when do you start then? When is it safe enough or good enough to start building, in order to avoid that sense of previously underlined like additional groups being added into the consideration after the fact. Like, I kind of feel like unless you can clearly and confidently identify the scope, maybe not the best word to use, but then like it feels like you could never do anything because you're always considering like the nature of decentered users or marginalized users. Not that means we shouldn't do it, but I guess you can kind of, I feel like it can kind of get Ouroboros like snake eating its tail sort of thing, like endlessly ideating for different kinds of cases, and then what's the process then, or what's the recommendation then? It's just interesting to underline Western frames of influence. Again, that was kind of one of the first mentions, I think, for like EU. There were other mentions, I think, but then here's the section where there's like Western frames of influence, and there's like US and EU centric. And then there's the mention of like a colonial mentality of technology has been hard to challenge, which is, you know, something that I was looking for, just that there are mentions of colonialization. In the next section on page 19, which is when they're not safe for all unsafe impacted communities, I was interested about like this process, and I would love to see and read more for like this section, which is means many technologies are built and then scaled in contexts that they were not designed for, which is why we are trying to be focused on the marginalized or the decentered and the decentered users. But then I want to understand what it means to scale and what it means to be advertised to countries and community where no impact assessment has been made. Or yeah, I feel like that needs examples, not necessarily in this paper, but I need examples of that happening. There are examples that get detailed about the harms that have been caused to different communities, but I would love to see examples of how the planning of the scaling and how the planning of the advertising has been done before the harms happen. Like, so you can see the harms are a result of premature scaling and advertising, but you know, I want to see more detail about like that scaling and advertising. Page 21, I've got a I found it interesting just to read this paragraph starting in numerous states. It talks about like how law enforcement is, you know, testing, using high-risk groups to test new tactics, which is really interesting. And then how it can be mitigated if these were designed for, with, inclusive of. And the thing that I sort of put around this latter paragraph about like including those groups within the design process was, because there's a comment about like later on, we just didn't intend for these things to happen, we didn't know, which is a plausible deniability. You know, we didn't intend for these things to happen and we didn't know, etc., and we didn't have the whatever was needed to be inclusive of them. But also plausible as the skeptic in me kind of thinks that plausible deniability is incredibly convenient, isn't it? Like in a lot of what I kind of felt in the corporate responsibility section was, well, who and how are we going to commit to these practices? And I've thought that a lot about this, not only within this paper's details, but often when I've been reading other kind of similar texts like Design Justice and other kinds of inclusive, better design practices. There's lots of, on page 23, I made a note because there's some interesting talk about foster sesta, which is something I'm interested in, and how it's impacted sex workers. But it kind of made me think of something that I discovered quite early on in my general career, which was that there is a stigma of designing for sex work. Like I don't see very publicly the people that do design work for like even legal, like adult and sex industry particularly. Like they're kind of, it's again, it kind of feels very colonial in that it's this very like hidden industry, and you have to go looking for it, and it's kind of billed as sleazy in whatever way it can be billed as, essentially. And yeah, designing for it is probably, and I've met designers that have designed for that industry and interviewed for that industry in some of my early career moments. But it does feel like it is a space that is difficult if you're not particularly interested to understand what the design needs, space, thoughts are generally. I didn't note down on this next section, in this next section particularly. I found it a really interesting section though, and the diagrams are really particularly kind of interesting. They kind of help try and explain things. I found the circle one kind of hard, harder to understand than this diagram here, which is the decentered cases, just being on that kind of the outside of that kind of bell curve diagram. So, I mean, to be honest, it kind of made sense that those were those. But so I guess like from my perspective, the decentered cases were always part of the marginalized users, and that the implicit value is about defining them as decentered, potentially. This is potentially the biggest takeaway that I'm taking away from my personal work from this paper. And then we go into the section about corporate responsibility, where I've made a note. And just like underlining some things like the UN standards make it clear that companies have human rights responsibilities. And I was like, well, yeah, sure. Every company knows, or every organization knows that there are like reasons why they should do good things with their tech. So like if freedom of expression is clarified for ICT companies, there is due diligence requires considering the human rights impacts of designing and engineering choices. And like then the examples, I think that this kind of hit very weak for me when they immediately go into the case studies, which are all big, reasonably big, high profile tech organizations that I am making like an assumption are reasonably well funded and therefore also targeted for human rights abuses and have had documented cases of human rights abuses, and therefore the due diligence becomes like more needed, right? So like it kind of makes me think, okay, well, how are other organizations that aren't large managing this? The case studies, though, in and of themselves, fascinating, fantastic, great. I didn't note this down, but I will say it now. So many of the case studies, or so many of these stories that are documented, seem to be documented around the LGBTQ+ community, like, and how harms have been done to that community. And it kind of, as a LGBT member of that community myself, I often kind of wonder why these are the most documented cases. Like it kind of makes me think about like the historical push that a lot of the LGBTQ+ community does to make sure that they are, you know, being cared for, or you know, not being oppressed, but also that it is a battleground of like legal back and forth, like legal recognition back and forth. Although, you know, you could say that it's been more successful than not successful. I mean, completely depending on how you identify, for sure. Like, for sure, rights have been taken away from different marginalized genders and sexualities. But anyway, it seems like it's one of the ones that is, I don't know, my question is it an easier community to talk about and to detail because of the process of decriminalization? And are other things harder to talk about and harder to use as examples because they were never, or the criminalization of other identities is older, more insidious, or more hidden within society, like race, ethnicity, and gender, like binary gender particularly. And I wonder if it is a little bit harder to push back against those kinds of things. Anyway, but yeah, it was interesting to just see some examples being focused on there. The examples are fantastic. I think these set of questions are really great. It felt like a very practical thing, a set of just questions like about how, when you're considering a decentered use case, what does this recommendation mean? Why is this needed? And how can this recommendation be implemented? Very practical sort of questions that if you're trying to actually do technology development, important questions to ask. I didn't make many other notes on the case studies. They are fantastic. Until like right at the end of the big case studies, where I just wrote all big tech and then like a sort of not an unhappy face, but kind of like a face, like why are they all kind of big tech? Kind of makes me think, you know, they're the most publicized, right? I guess, and the most able to make and consider changes. Anyway, the case studies finish on page 46. And then the next page goes into apps and tools for at-risk, marginalized and vulnerable groups by design. So this is where things get a little bit more interesting, but also a little bit lighter in terms of detail. Because while it has so this is the section 6 tools on page 47, but it talks about the Circular app, which is a great app and got a great blurb on how to do what it does and why, but not as much detail on some of the specific design related things, and that could be again by design from this report, in that if you expose that kind of stuff, it could be unengineered by maliciousness. Like, this is a public report, so obviously it's the same with some of the scenarios and broader concepts. Like, they're great. Like the next one is a fantastic idea about double pin secret folders. So like having two versions of the same app where one password accesses a like a censored version, and another password accesses a version with more sensitive conversations or data. But then made me think about, I mean, with all of these different things that are meant to help protect vulnerable use cases, I always think about how it can be exploited. And like anything built to undo harms or to protect can always be exploited maliciously in some way, shape or form. We always find that. And I kind of think about like, okay, where's the paper around like, or where's the thinking around like, some of the work that a colleague has done, Molly, in Simply Secure, around like persona non gratas and anxiety use cases from another colleague here where I work, Kate, around like what are the things, how can this be used maliciously against anyone, and who would that anyone be? And then it made me think more about some of the stuff that Johnny Ray Evans has written about a fair little while ago about red team, blue team for design cases. So red team, blue team is like this blue team, I think the blue team is the team that kind of describes what is going to be built, and the red team tries to do the worst that they could possibly do with that tool or information, tries to exploit it. But a lot of these like broader examples are really fantastic. I wrote down after these examples on page 53 that I found the examples way more helpful than the framework methodology section, so the earlier sections, even though they were interesting context. The case studies really helped me to understand them in terms of like what I actually do as a designer. They were just easier to fill my brain with like, oh, this is why you would do this. I made a kind of weird note in this section, which was about adjacent work in other industries. It's an interesting section to kind of read through, and the note that I made was in the resilience building section here, where I noted like how it describes like how post-disaster strengthening, improving conditions in low-income communities, they're more likely to be impacted and susceptible to natural disasters. And it talks about like, I don't know where this quote comes from, but fresh attention to communities experiencing historical neglect. It kind of didn't sit very well with me as like a section, because it kind of, while I understand that that is the space to do the investment in, so that those spaces, communities, physically and like through the community-ness, because it's not always just about rebuilding physical infrastructure, sometimes it's about emotional people infrastructure in those places and those kind of communities. It kind of, I don't know, I wrote down the word gentrification and colonial because I kind of wondered whether the onward impact of that within that industry is thought of, and whether that's actually a design problem for designers to come in on or not. Anyway, kind of interesting. The last section is about the identifying decentered use cases, which I admittedly just found very, very difficult to try and break down. But it breaks it down into stages, which is like which is like stage 1, what tool and what context, which makes a lot of sense. Like, what are you trying to do? It kind of goes back to those questions in one of the case studies. And then like trying to find consultants essentially, and it's trying to kind of describe the consultant process a little bit further down in the section here, and like their expertise. And then there's like a basic example, which is like, this is the tool, this is what we want to do. Research and consultation into what tools are dominant in what context. So, but that feels like I feel like one of the comments I made earlier on, which is like around the social aspect, is like there are not infinite maybe, but like high numbers of different contexts with specificity within those contexts, that it kind of feels like, wow, how do you put a pin in where you stop with that kind of stuff? In the next section, which is like zooming in on the decentered, which arguably makes, you know, a lot of sense. It makes perfect sense. There's talk about like collaboration, and this is kind of where the participatory and I think co-design sort of things kind of come in. But like it sort of describes like this in-depth collaboration. Vulnerable users requires in-depth collaboration, research, and trust building, but it doesn't necessarily describe how that can be done, or whether that can be done, and how that could be done, and who should be doing that. I think that one of the things that I thought of when I was reading that section is how there are certain collaborations that have different requirements to other collaborations, and it makes me think of like the ethnographic approach, but the inherently like colonial, you know, privileged approach to ethnographic, like anthropology approaches to understanding cultural contexts. And then it also kind of made me question a lot of like that nature of that collaboration, and the extractiveness. Is it extractive? How extractive? Things like that. And an interesting section around like hiring in context, which was really interesting, specifically because like the people that are, they sort of basically in a nutshell say the people that you should be consulting or collaborating with are not going to be accessible via the means that you expect, essentially, and it requires a deep community approach to knowing those people essentially, and having like the ability to contact them outside of like what is typical privileged access to the web. Like this person describes themselves not being on any sort of social profiles of any description, or any stretch of the imagination. They describe LinkedIn profile. And then the last stage, building for the decentered, I think this is the last stage. There's like a section here which I highlighted, which is like work with experts, consultants, and others connected about the situation in order to identify needs, which is a really great statement. I could 100% agree, hard agree again. One of the things that I found in one of the projects that I did, where we did take that approach, was that the thing that I think is missing here is understanding what the experts, consultants, and the people connected's goals are generally, not specifically through the lens of what you're trying to do as a tool builder, but like what are overarchingly their goals, needs, thoughts, ideas, those kinds of things. Because again, it's kind of trying to move against that extractive nature, or that center of the universe. Our tool build is the center of this universe right now, and to some extent it's the center of the conversation, but ignoring the goals and needs of those being collaborated with, I don't feel like is something that should be overlooked. There is another section which is stage 4, and regeneralizing what is built for all users. But again, I didn't necessarily make notes on that section. And then the last thing that I made a note on, which is in the kind of concluding words and wrap up, it's something that I just kind of realized as I finished off this paper is a lot of what was talked about as decentered cases are, I don't think this is the best way to describe them, but like external things. So like a group, or like things that the groups do, so or are. So like a lot of the decentered users or communities are described as sex workers or undocumented refugees, or, you know, things that are evidence based, like you can like describe in some way. I don't feel like that's the best way of describing it, but the thing that I felt like was missing, which hopefully contextualizes what I think was clear in the paper, the thing that felt like was missing from a lot of the conversation in this paper is the internal decenteredness or marginalizations generally. So, you know, I thought a lot about like neurodiversity, even though that's kind of, I guess, would be covered in the iceberg under accessibility, but made me think about like what the impact of neurodiverseness is within the social context, the political context, and the legal context, and things like that. But also like internalized things that we either know or don't know. And I think a lot about this within human rights focused design, which is like how, and I've had this question for a little while, is like when you're working with a community and consulting with a community or an individual around a particular topic about how to do well by a, design well by a tool within a community, how do you design for and plan for things that those consultants and communities are unaware of, if they are unaware of them? So like, what about like the internalized like discrimination that is had, and whether or not everybody has realized that they may have internalized discrimination around like certain identity characterizations or intersectioning identities. So I was kind of thinking about, how do we understand decentered users in terms of like the internal stuff as well? And I think that was a big question. I don't feel like again, needs more research. Again, this paper report would not cover absolutely everything all the time. It does a really good job of covering what it you know, sets out to cover. But yeah, I do kind of have lots of questions. Anyway, I hope I hope this is an interesting summary of something I wrote. And also helps me to process what I learned and what I think about it. Anyway, thanks.